These days, it's all too common to hear the mantra of stop pre-ordering video games. After all, you can only be burned by terrible launch dates so many times before you become jaded. This list will look at games that did get better eventually, but were best avoided when they were first released. I'm Cy for WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 video games you shouldn't have played at launch. Number 10. The Callisto Protocol. Starting with the most recent example, and the one that inspired this list, many thought that for just a moment that the Callisto Protocol might be where the line is drawn on games released in an unfinished state. Ironically, the argument and the issue is far from done. Helmed by Glenn Schofield, famed Dead Space co-creator, the Callisto Protocol seemed like it might be a worthy spiritual successor. Views were mixed on release, with some loving the retro survival horror clunk feeling of the title's mechanics, and others calling the game outdated and slow. The PlayStation 5 version of the Callisto Protocol ran perfectly fine with a steady and locked 60 FPS. However, the Xbox version seemed to be a much lesser affair, with unstable performance and even missing certain graphical elements like reflections. The PC version fared even worse, riddled with stuttering on top of all of the other problems. With Schofield's team at Striking Distance Studios being assisted by Sony staff and signing a deal for PlayStation marketing exclusivity, it was either a horrible coincidence or a damning indictment of favouritism. Within the first couple of weeks, the game received an update that not just alleviated bugs but also sped up the gameplay, making it already better than it was if you struggled through it at launch. And hopefully from here on out it only gets better and better. Number 9. CYBERPUNK 2077. This list is in no particular order, but it seems prudent to get the most obvious and foulest stench out of the way early. CYBERPUNK 2077, despite some very strong competition, is almost certainly the most infamously bad launch of all time. What makes the entire situation even worse was the title's development time. Gamers were so familiar with the yellow social media calling card that CD Projekt Red used to announce yet another delay for CYBERPUNK that it became a popular prank to make your own. And yet, despite all the delays, the final product still managed to be delivered as totally unfinished. Those players who could afford high-end PCs were off to the races, but consoles were a whole other story. To say that the Xbox One and PS4 versions were a dumpster fire is putting it lightly. Frame rate drops, texture pop-in, T-posing NPCs, and all manner of nonsense. On release, the internet flooded with clips of graphical and collision glitches, and the story found itself into the mainstream news. Microsoft and Sony even had to step in to offer refunds and warn new purchasers of the game's performance issues. In the 2 years since CYBERPUNK became the punching bag of gaming, it's gotten a lot better to be sure, but it will never ever shake its reputation as one of the biggest missteps in entertainment history. Number 8. Battlefield 2042. Across the 2010s in particular, DICE had managed to create a reliable competitor to the gargantuan Call of Duty series with Battlefield. Multiple entries in the franchise had been reviewed and received very positively. By comparison, on launch, 2021's Battlefield 2042 became one of the worst reviewed games on Steam. Players were already prepared to bomb the title due to lackluster story and gameplay, but it didn't help that the game was missing a laundry list of expected features that were standard for the series and the genre. No leaderboards, no team deathmatch, and no real matchmaking support. In their place, it seemed, were bugs. Lots and lots of bugs. The mega franchise's concurrent players declined pretty quickly, and DICE struggled against the wave of fair criticism. In January 2022, they even attempted to remove the popular game type Rush before returning it to the title due to backlash. It was clear they had no idea what they were doing. Still, DICE maintained that they were committed to making the product more worthwhile, and the game is admittedly in a more acceptable state now after a year of updates. Still, being the shiniest turd is all well and good, but at its core, 2042 still remains a bit of a turd. Number 7. Final Fantasy XIV. Ending support of their previous MMO and starting a new one, Final Fantasy creator Square Enix had to make sure what they released next would be worthwhile for new players, as well as those jumping from Final Fantasy XI to what would become Final Fantasy XIV. Players were immediately critical of many aspects of the game. It was pretty on the surface, but the interface was a mess, and the game seemed to demand a pretty intense, not to mention boring, grind for leveling up characters. Moreover, it wasn't a game that was free of the standard fare of performance issues. Square scrambled to find solutions, which consisted of extending free trials to keep people playing and firing its director and producer from their roles. For the next 2 years, the game struggled, but in all fairness to Square, they made the right move by looking at its flawed existence and putting it out of its misery. In a stunning turn, Final Fantasy XIV would have a cataclysmic event that was so grand it was purposely designed to end the world. The servers were shut down to be reopened 9 months later as a totally new take on FF14 built from the ground up. And wouldn't you know it, Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn is a solid MMO that has only grown in popularity in the last decade. All's well that ends well. Number 6. No Man's Sky. No Man's Sky stands out from its company on this list by at least releasing in a more functional and playable state, which really shouldn't be a compliment we have to give. However, what made its launch notable was the collective sound of disappointment it produced across the web, as if a legion of gamers pulled a face and went, oh. The hype for the game was pretty palpable before release, as Sean Murray, the creator of the project, had promised some big things. A space exploration title that would boldly go further than any other game of its ilk, it promised a procedurally generated universe with an almost infinite number of planets to explore. Whilst technically this was true, gamers found the title to be severely underwhelming. The planets were boring, the ships were samey, and the game was missing a lot of content that had been promised, not least of all multiplayer functionality. The truth was that Murray had removed the feature last minute, and so physical copies of the game even mentioned online play where it didn't exist. Regardless, No Man's Sky kept trucking along. Free updates to the game certainly have restored faith in the studio amongst its core fanbase. On release, it was one of the worst reviewed games on Steam, and now No Man's Sky is officially seen as mostly positive, which is quite the impressive redemption. Number 5. Halo the Master Chief Collection. The best of the Halo series marries a captivating campaign with some of the best multiplayer action in the arena of arcade-style FPS titles. As such, when 343 Industries revealed a collection of the franchise's major entries, fans were ecstatic. Every game, including the newly reworked Halo 2 Anniversary, in one place with all of the multiplayer content to boot. Except if you played the Master Chief Collection on launch day, that is. Whilst the campaigns all ran fine, the multiplayer portion broke immediately. Servers were unreliable and frustrating, with long loading times and low success rates. The game taunted helpless players with its wealth of maps, modes, and nostalgia. It also included a 15GB day one patch, which already made gamers wait plenty of time to even get into the title's menus, only to find that half the game wouldn't even go anywhere. 343 publicly apologised and launched patches, slowly but surely getting the game running again. They also compensated early adopters with a free install of side game Halo 3 ODST. The Master Chief Collection still gets support today, and when bringing the title over to the next generation, the studio were exceptionally careful and performed rigorous tests to avoid a repeat of the last time. Number 4. The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. Considering that Skyrim has become one of those games that seems to release a new port every 9 minutes or so, it's undoubtedly picked up plenty of players who weren't there for the disastrous launch. And in a way, we should have anticipated it. 2010's Fallout New Vegas had it all. Corrupted saves, game freezes, and NPCs whose heads would spin on their necks like something out of a horror film. Despite being developed by Obsidian Entertainment, as the publisher, Bethesda were equally culpable for this mess. However, whilst the Xbox 360 fans were largely in decent stead on 11/11/11 when Skyrim dropped, PlayStation's install base had been delivered a product that felt terribly rushed and had major issues. The largest of these was problems that occurred after a player's save size exceeded a certain amount, causing horrific slowdown and snail's pace frame rate. A patch was launched, but for many PS3 and PC players, these just added more crashes which needed to be corrected in further updates. With all the hype and marketing around Skyrim, which lest we forget is the entry in the franchise that made Elder Scrolls mainstream, it was excruciating for those who were only able to watch others play the most anticipated game of 2011. Number 3. Batman Arkham Knight. Despite high review scores, it's fair to say that Rockstar's return to the Batman Arkham franchise didn't go out with a bang with parts of its audience. Arkham Knight was a multi-format release where the PC version felt like it had been left out to dry. Players immediately started reporting that the game was running poorly. That's right, the gang's all here: low-res textures, sudden crashes, and slow-motion frame rate. Not only was this AAA blockbuster in 2015 running at 30 frames per second, that was at the best of times. Gliding and driving the Batmobile could bring Arkham Knight down to a paltry 10 frames a second. A day after release, the game was pulled from Steam and gamers were refunded. You could still play it if you owned it, but you likely wouldn't enjoy it. It took over 2 months for the game to be patched properly and another 2 months for it to return to sale, upon which it was still not without technical hiccups. You don't need to be the world's greatest detective to know that somebody messed up, be that the game's quality assurance team or the publishers keen to rush it to meet the deadline. Number 2. SimCity 2013. SimCity games are a special thing because they don't always come around all that often. Like the Master Chief Collection, 2013 SimCity also suffered server issues on day one. What made it even worse though was that it affected the entire game. EA, in their infinite wisdom, had decided that the title needed to be online at all times to play. So when the servers immediately fell apart, it pretty much made SimCity a block of dead weight on consumers' hard drives. For a studio who is intent on the games as a service format, it was not a positive sign. Despite the problems, developers Maxis said that SimCity would stay online only because it would take a serious amount of work to undo what was baked into the code. Mere hours later, they were proven to be talking absolute tosh when fans effectively found the on and off switch that allowed players to play offline. Eventually, 10 months later, Maxis updated the game with their own offline-only mode. Aside from all this drama, SimCity was unfortunately let down by crummy reviews. Whilst not a terrible game at all and absolutely worth playing for fans of the genre, it created a hole that City Skylines came in and filled by being more focused on the game itself rather than a service. Number 1. Star Wars Battlefront 2. 2017 Star Wars Battlefront 2 caused a storm of hatred on release. Despite being a solid team shooter, the game had lots of locked-off content, such as the ability to play as notable Star Wars figures. In true Electronic Arts fashion, these were only accessible with additional purchases or extreme grinds. Famously, one Reddit user estimated that it would take 40 hours of constant playing to earn the credits to unlock Darth Vader. EA's characteristically awful defense to this was that they wanted players to feel as though they had earned their unlockables. And this remains the most downvoted comment in Reddit history by quite some margin. 5 months later, EA put out an update that made all characters available to everyone. The company's continually sketchy microtransactions practices with pay-to-win aspects even got them the ire of politicians. It was this controversy that led the Belgian Gaming Commission to ban loot boxes in video games in their country altogether. Technically, Battlefront 2 saw these mechanics ripped from the game just before launch, but if you had been eager enough to get into the pre-release, then you would have no doubt become aware of the show that lost EA $3 billion in company value. And yet, when DICE ended development support for the game in 2020, they had turned opinion around enough that there were even petitions for them to continue to provide updates. That's one heck of a turnaround. And that's the list. Let us know what you thought of this video down in the comments below. Which of these games did you play at launch and did you regret it? Which of these games has improved the most in your opinion? And of course, let us know of any others that we missed. Make sure you like this video, share it with your friends, subscribe and hit that notification bell. You can find more content like this one over at WhatCulture.com. I've been Cy for WhatCulture, and have a good week.